Hey, Miranda, I was talking to the pastoral visitors last week, and I said, Miranda, she's so amazing at pastoral care.
They.
What?
You said she. My pronoun is they.
Oh, okay, whatever. I was trying to compliment you. Did you even hear me? I was trying to say that I was saying how great you were at pastoral care.
Yeah, it is so hard not to misgender me. What a typical cisgender response. I don't want to talk about this anymore. Leslie, I am really angry that you misgendered me at the staff meeting again. You just can't seem to get it right. Are you even trying?
I apologize, Miranda. You're right. This is really important, and I'm going to have to figure out a way that I can not make this mistake again.
Hey, Leslie, I just wanted to let you know that you misgendered me a couple of times in that meeting.
Yes, I know, and I've really tried, and it's hard. It's hard for me to change this in my head, even though I try.
It matters to me that you refer to me with they them pronouns, even when it's difficult to remember, because other people listen to you. When you model correct pronoun use, it shows other people how to treat me and other trans people.
Okay, I hear you, and I will try to remember.
Hey, Reverend Leslie, you used the wrong pronoun just there. Don't forget it's they.
Oh my God, I can't believe I did that again. I am such a
No,
I'm
it's
just
okay.
like such a bad person. Like I can't I try really, really hard and I know you're gonna hate me now and I feel so ashamed of myself and it's just awful. It's just awful for me.
You're not awful. I'm sorry I said anything. I just, I don't want to make you feel bad. I just wanted to let you know.
Ugh, I can't believe this. This is gonna ruin my whole day. Hey, Miranda, I just want to apologize to you for misgendering you just a minute ago.
Thanks for saying something. It does start to bother me after a while, but I understand it can take a while to get used to they, them pronouns.
Do you have any suggestions for ways that I can get better at this?
Oh, sure. I'll send you a link to a website where you can practice using unfamiliar pronouns. But you could also reach out to a practice buddy, and the two of you can practice sentences like, "This is Miranda. They are non binary. I am glad to know them." And get a little support that way.
Thank you. That would be really helpful. I'll look for that link.
Sounds good.
In 1980, songwriter Niles Rodgers went on a bad date. And when he came home, he wrote these lyrics. Watching the late show, I made up my mind, oh, a love that's a free like a love should be, falling behind, oh. Don't you see you are the one I couldn't have begun? No, your love is canceled. Rodgers, then part of the black disco band Chic, probably could have been knocked down with a feather at that point if you had told him that the words he penned that night in what became a fairly unsuccessful song would become the rallying cry of white conservatives 40 years later. Washington Post reporter Clyde McGrady details this in his article, The Strange Journey of Cancel, from a black cultural punchline to a white grievance watchword. And a strange journey it is, indeed, one of the strange ones we're all on in this world of many truths. During this year of sheltering, we've had an intense look at some of the ways that inequality works, both for individuals and in systems. And whether it's in public health or in public safety, in the economy or in our housing or healthcare systems, we know that we are increasingly understanding that our systems tend to work better for some and not as well for others. Whether it's the prevalence of sexual predation encountered by women in all kinds of occupations, or the effort to erase the gains and indeed the very beings of transgendered persons among us. The end times feeling of the assault on our democracy, the reality of climate change, and the sobering threat of this ever-present COVID-19 seems to have taken away people's willingness to play nice. People are speaking out like never before, and other people are responding. It was actually my son Liam who lit our chalice this morning, who was the one that said that I should preach a sermon about how cancel culture is not compatible with Unitarian Universalism. And that led me on a actually rather long and fascinating journey that begins with Roger's song. It was featured just a little bit later in a black gangsta movie classic, New Jack City, and then it entered the black language generator from which so many of our iconic cultural expressions come. The same Washington Post reporter observed this in his article from Renee Blake, who's a linguistics professor at NYU. One of the biggest exports of American culture is African American language. With canceled and woke, there's a twist. Not only have these words become appropriated from black culture, but they have become weaponized to sneer at the values of many young black liberals. Like the term politically correct has been reshaped by those who resist change. As I said, this was a journey, and I'm going to try to take you on it in this very brief period that we have together. I want to start by talking a little bit about calling out, this form of accountability, which is basically the practice of naming something that people have known to have been true for a very long time, but which they have chosen not to say, often because of social pressures. For example, it's not that police violence against black people or mentally ill people has radically increased or has just started. It's that we are suddenly hearing about it when it happens, because people are documenting it, because we have that technology. And I just want you to know that it was in hearing the reports of the Derek Chauvin trial that one of the things that brought tears to my eyes was the idea of this 9-year-old child documenting this event on the phone. The fact is that we know that young children see these things, but some of us are only having to start to grapple with it, and that's been part of calling out. Calling out sometimes is necessary to bring what is true out from behind the structures that keep those truths from being known. And speaking the truth is a foundation of our Unitarian and our Universalist faiths. When an injustice is exposed, it's hard to see, and many might want to blame the one who dragged it out into the light of day. How many of us were kept in abusive situations because we were told, we don't air our dirty laundry in public, or nobody wants to hear that. It's rude to discuss. I think that we are seeing a generational shift around this, a shift that's saying that the airing needs to occur in a public way to take away the power of the secrecy that abusers require to survive. One of the ways the term cancel culture was distorted when it was co-opted by the conservative part of our nation is that it was used by them to mean any stating of harm or hurt, not the extreme sanction that was used, for example, against men with long records of repeated abuse of women, which is where the black community first used it. The minimization of patterns of abuse is a basis for allowing systemic abuse. And remember the fear that so many of us felt just a little while ago when it became clear that documentation of Donald Trump's abuse of women would not keep him from being a political candidate, nor keep him from being elected. Cancel culture, as it was used by black women, was used to hold black public figures accountable. It meant taking away someone's influence and their authority when they were a person who was using that influence, power, and authority to harm others. That form would be consistent with our sense of justice and equity, and it makes sense. We do not want people who are abusive to have a platform, as Miranda puts it, for their abuse. The dismissal of a person because of a single minor violation is not what this is about either. This bad date that Niles Rogers went on was not just an ordinary bad date, I need to say. It was really a truly bad date with a person who was rude and abusive. And he said, nope, not going forward with this. And this is where it gets tricky, because how we call one another to account matters. And perfectionism in the dominant culture can cause us trouble as well. We'll get back to that in a moment. Most recently, some young far-right politicians held a conference where they made fun of efforts to ensure public safety for all, including those with darker skin, and also the use of pronouns to support transgender people. They were asserting that these were just little things and that the reaction was a ridiculous, overblown thing. They used examples like the recasting of toys to be less gendered, which is actually a real issue for kids, the same way that seeing only blonde dolls was an issue for children of color for so many decades. And yet the calling out over matters of life and death was reduced to a silly and trivial thing. We do not need to be reminded of this importance of accountability only a few weeks after Derek Chauvin's conviction of murder. And we who affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all life know that these assertions of individual rights are important. What is insidious about the whole cancel culture debate is that it distracts us from the larger systemic issues and casts them as petty individual ones. And that is a moral outrage. The naming of injustice is essential. Taking power away from people who use it to abuse others makes sense. And the journey continues. The kind of cancel culture it implies is because someone has done something that bad, they are irrevocably bad. And that is not true in our faith tradition. That is never true in our faith tradition. It may mean they should not be in a place of power or privilege, but we do not believe that we should appoint people to a permanent place of shame or discomfort among us if they are willing to make changes and to live a different life. Any statement, however, that might make someone feel uncomfortable or shamed is not necessarily an effort to cancel them. Sometimes it is just, as the little set of vignettes between Miranda and I illustrate, an attempt to say something that needs to be said. And there are ways to say it, and there are ways to respond. We need to be the ones who think about this because we know that there are many complications, including the fact that people always have the right to distance themselves from a relationship in which they have been damaged if that is required for their continued safety and healing. Yet we are the inheritors of a tradition which has the doctrine of universal salvation, which gives all the possibility of redemption. When we talk about these issues of how we learn and how we unlearn the oppressive behaviors that are all around us in our culture, we have to learn more about covenant, about staying in the conversation even when it gets hard and complicated. So naming the truth is consistent with our values. Shaming and condemning are not. So what do we do? Because sometimes when we attempt to name, as you saw in the one of the vignettes between Miranda and I, the person who has been called out or even called in can feel their own sense of shame. Sometimes we do this. We call people in. We remind each other of the commitments that we share. We need to have ways to call each other in to the larger vision of the world we want to create together. Just as sometimes we have to also call people out. There are people in our leadership, in our local communities who have done this. And we have needed sometimes to do this, and to do this so that others will not literally lose their lives. We, as people of good faith, know that we care about both the individual and their dignity and also the greater family of humanity, and that both are important and in tension with one another. That's part of the covenant. The covenant doesn't say, we're in it together, so we'll just never say anything that offends each other. The covenant says, we're going to keep trying to figure out how to communicate with one another so that together we can figure out how we can say what we need to say and not allow some to suffer in silence so that others can continue to feel okay. Whether it's something that's been done by someone that is truly terrible or something that is just a mistake, we need to practice how to do this together. And while our little set of scenarios was a teaching, I want to say publicly that I offer my experience of having misgendered our beloved intern Miranda Lennox. And when I did so, there were times that I really wanted to cancel myself. I felt a deep sense of inner shame that had nothing to do with Miranda's gracious or compassionate response. Perhaps the most important lesson that I have learned is that often I hear things through my own lens of self-criticism. It's like an inner crescent wrench moment. That's how I think of it. Because when I was a child, I would get sent by my father, who was often not very happy, to bring him a tool. And if he asked me for a crescent wrench, I always had a moment of panic because I had one time mistaken a pair of pliers for a crescent wrench. And when I came back, it was not received graciously. So whenever he asked me for pliers or a crescent wrench, even though I knew them in my calmer moments, I would go down and stare at the toolbox, frozen, afraid I would bring the wrong one. That's how it works. Sometimes those inner voices are our worst enemy. It's not what the other person says, it's what we say to ourselves, but we hear through that lens great criticism in the other person as well. I don't want to feel all those hard feelings again, and so I avoid those crescent wrench moments. When they come, I can be irritated, angry, defensive. I can make it all about me and my feelings. I have to take that breath. I have to remind myself of my accountability to the relationship. And in this case, I asked Miranda to write the last line I read, because as a liberation theologian teaches us, we should always have the preferential option for the person harmed. They should get the last word, in other words. As we go forward as a community, wanting to educate and acknowledge each other, I think there are some important things we need to learn. Not to cancel ourselves is probably at the top of the list, and to learn to listen to what is really being said. As we come back together from our little pods of isolation, it might be a really important time to practice this, I'm noticing. So when we make a mistake, we can say, "Oh, I made a mistake," and not make the other person make us feel better. We can do our own inner work to see what it is, crescent wrenches and other things that may be causing us our own problem, so we don't project our fury with ourselves onto others and convince ourselves that their response was over the top and find ourselves in victim blaming. Victim blaming is another thing that we need to think about in this whole cancel culture piece. We saw a lot of victim blaming in the trial of Derek Chauvin, which many, many, many people refer to as the trial of George Floyd. And we take the time, when we take the time to be careful about these tricky turns and navigations in these journeys, where we balance the respect for the individuals and their inherent worth with the need for the knowledge that we are all interdependent in these broken systems, then the role of justice and equity as the bridge between these two becomes more apparent. Yes, within our own community, we need to avoid the self-righteous alienation of calling people out unnecessarily when what we really need to do is call them in. We don't need to play the gotcha game with anyone, which I see happen more often actually with people trying to be helpful to someone else in a targeted group. This kind of truth-telling can be also a calling in if we do it within the covenantal understanding, a commitment especially to directly address one another when we can, when that is something that we feel we can do with safety and without further harm. Doing that direct address allows us to have that further dialogue that might lead us to a greater understanding. And we need to always remember that though someone may take themselves off limits because they do not want to talk with us again after we have done something that causes them harm, there is always another conversation that we can have for their health and our own spiritual and mental health. Sometimes we just have to say what we need to say. And in this world where life, we are been reminded, is such a gift, and it's too short to wait in and waste in false politeness, we may find that some people are doing this more and more. Some of us feel that it's important. Diverting our energy into attacking individuals when we need to change systems is really the worship of a false god. It won't bring real change, and that is outside our shared values here. These oppressive systems hurt us all. Niles Rodgers, he was harmed a lot more by something that happened after he wrote that song than by that date that inspired the song, Your Love Is Canceled. He was actually really impacted when his musical genre, which was disco, was basically undermined by a band of predominantly white people who launched an attack on disco, which was the music genre of many Black and also LGBTQ people of the time. At a Chicago White Sox game, people were invited to bring disco records and to smash them on the field between a doubleheader. Some brought other forms of Black art instead and other forms of Black music, in what was clearly a racist rally and the end of disco as a lucrative stream for people for a very long time. People like Niles. Those are system problems. They're not just individual problems, and it takes more to dismantle systems than it does to have a moment of righteous indignation or even to go out on a couple protests. The long-term commitment is our invitation to call people along on a journey that's going to take a lot more time. So may we find the place and the way to make that deep ask from a place outside of ourselves in this truth-naming, values-colliding world, a place that is rooted in the sources of love, serenity, and peace. Though we do not need to be led by those who cannot affirm others' full humanity, neither should we deny them their humanity if they, down the road, show a willingness to change. Though holding others and ourselves accountable for our treatment of one another is not always tidy and comfortable, the alternative is a world in which the comfort of some is held above the basic safety and right to life of others. So may our faith be a guide towards a truth that is clear and compassionate, where we don't say your love is canceled, but your hate might be. May we be the ones to strengthen and not break the circle.